St. Patrick's welcomed the parishioners of St. Patrick's with a drizzle of rain and a chill wind off the bay. Father Malachi Donovan adjusted the collar of his robe and glanced at his watch, half an hour before morning mass. At this time of year, the congregation was usually sparse, mostly elderly women and a few regulars from the local business community. St. Patrick's Church was located in the old part of town, among Victorian mansions and neat fishermen's cottages. Its gray walls, darkened by time and the humid sea air, held many stories. Malachi liked to come here early in the morning, when the first rays of sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, creating whimsical patterns on the stone floor. Sister Agatha was already in the sacristy, arranging fresh flowers and checking the cleanliness of the altar cloths. Her wrinkled face brightened at the sight of the priest. "Good morning, Father Malachi. I made fresh tea. Would you like a cup before the service?" "Thank you, Sister Agatha, but I'd better check my notes for the sermon." In his small office, Malachi often reflected on how his life had changed during his 12 years of ministry. He remembered himself as a young seminarian, full of idealistic ideas about his vocation. Now, at 42 years of age, his faith remained strong, but had acquired a deeper, more seasoned understanding of human nature. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. On the threshold stood Sister Agatha. "Father Malachi, sorry to disturb you, but we have a new cleaning lady here, the one Mrs. Sullivan from the charity committee was talking about." A young woman was waiting for him in the reception area. Her dark hair was gathered into a simple bun, and there was a look of wariness in her large brown eyes. She rose as Malachi entered and bowed slightly. "My name is Yesenia Rojas, Padre." Her voice was soft, with a slight accent. "Mrs. Sullivan said you needed an assistant." Malachi noted her modest clothing and strained hands. There had been an increasing number of immigrants from Latin America in their neighborhood lately, many looking for work in churches and charitable organizations. "Yes, of course. Sister Agatha will bring you up to speed. There's a lot of work, but we appreciate those who treat it with respect." In the weeks that followed, Malachi often spotted Yesenia at work. She moved quietly and inconspicuously, but her presence changed the familiar atmosphere of the church in a strange way. Sometimes he heard her quietly humming Spanish hymns as she wiped pews or arranged prayer books. One morning he found her in the chapel of the Virgin Mary. Yesenia stood before a statue, and the morning light streaming through the stained glass window colored her face with delicate hues. She did not notice his presence, completely immersed in prayer. Malachi felt something tingle in his heart, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. In the evenings, as he prepared for the next sermon, he found his thoughts returning more and more often to the image of the young woman bowed in prayer. It bothered him. He tried to concentrate on his work, spending more time in prayer, but the unwelcome thoughts returned again and again. One day, Brendan O'Reilly, the successful owner of a chain of fish restaurants and a generous church sponsor, lingered after the service. "Father Malachi, I noticed the new cleaning lady. Are you sure you checked her credentials? You have to be careful these days." "Mr. O'Reilly, the church is open to anyone needing help in work," Malachi replied, feeling unexpectedly irritated by the question. That evening he met Yesenia at the exit of the church. She looked tired after a long day's work. "Padre, may I ask you a question?" She hesitated. "Next Sunday is the feast of the Holy Virgin of Guadalupe. May I decorate her altar with traditional flowers?" "Of course, Yesenia, that's a wonderful idea." Their gazes met, and for a moment it was as if time had stopped. In the thickening dusk, Malachi felt the ground go from under his feet, and for the first time in his many years of service, he was truly afraid. The winter in Portland had been surprisingly mild. The snow was rare, but the rain drizzled more often, turning the streets into mirrored surfaces. Father Malachi found more and more occasions to stay late at the church, especially on days when Yesenia finished work later than usual. On one such evening, he was helping her put up the Christmas decorations. Their hands accidentally touched as they adjusted the garland together, and they both froze. Yesenia was the first to break the silence with a story about how Christmas was celebrated in her home village in Guatemala. Her voice, quiet and melodious, mesmerized Malachi. Sister Agatha began to notice a change in the priest's demeanor. His sermons remained as inspired as ever, but there was a certain detachment in his gaze. She often found him staring out the office window, which overlooked the churchyard where Yesenia usually worked. "Father Malachi, you seem distracted lately," she once remarked as she brought him his morning tea. "Perhaps you should take some time off." "That's all right, Sister Agatha. Just thinking a lot about the new social program for immigrants." Indeed, Malachi had begun to actively develop a program to help newcomers. He organized free English courses and legal advice. Yesenia helped with translation and recruited other immigrants. Her natural kindness and organizational skills came to full fruition. Brendan O'Reilly watched with growing discontent. He was concerned about the growing number of immigrants in the church, especially illegal immigrants. After one of the services, he held up Malachi for a conversation. "Father, I understand your desire to help all who are suffering, but don't you think you're getting a little too carried away? Our regular parishioners are beginning to worry." "Mr. O'Reilly, the church has always been a haven for those in need. That's our mission." "Perhaps. But I've heard talk, especially about your new assistant. People notice the way you look at her." Malachi felt his back grow cold. O'Reilly continued, "I wouldn't want the church's reputation to suffer, or for the immigration office to take an interest in our parish." The threat was barely veiled. After that conversation, Malachi became more cautious, but he couldn't bring himself to stay away from Yesenia. They began meeting at the town library, where she was studying for her GED, the equivalent of a high school diploma. "I want to study further," she shared her plans. "Maybe become a nurse. In Guatemala, I started medical school, but I had to run away." Gradually, she told him her story, about being chased by the drug cartel that had killed her brother, about the long journey through Mexico, about the first months in the US when she had to hide and take any job she could get. Their relationship developed imperceptibly, like spring flowers breaking through the last of the snow. Casual touches, long stares, conversations lingering until dark. Malachi realized he was crossing the line, but he couldn't and wouldn't stop. In March, Yesenia began the process of applying for political asylum. Malachi helped her find a good lawyer through church connections. In the evenings, they prepared the documents together in his office, and every such evening was both agony and happiness. Sister Agatha caught them together more and more often, and her suspicions grew. She noticed how Malachi's expression changed when Yesenia appeared, how they exchanged glances during the service. One day she found the scarf Yesenia had forgotten in the sacristy and smelled a slight perfume. Not at all what one would expect from a simple cleaning woman. Spring was early and warm in Portland. Yesenia often worked in the church garden, planting flowers and tending the roses. Malachi watched her for long periods of time from his office window, fighting the temptation to come down and join her. One evening, O'Reilly caught sight of them in the garden. They were just talking, standing among the flowering bushes, but something in their postures, in how close they were to each other, made him frown. The next day, a letter came to the church demanding cuts in funding for social programs. "Padre," Yesenia said when she heard about it, "maybe I should leave. I don't want to cause trouble." "No," Malachi replied, firmer than he intended. "We'll find other sources of funding." That night, they kissed for the first time, casually, unintentionally, after a long conversation about the future of the Immigrant Assistance Program. That kiss changed everything. It was the point of no return, the moment when they both realized that their feelings were stronger than fear, duty, and vows. The next morning, Sister Agatha found Yesenia's forgotten hairpin in Malachi's office, and her suspicions were confirmed. The summer heat covered Portland with a sweltering blanket. Tourists filled the streets of the old city. Locals sought coolness by the water. St. Patrick's Church was still a quiet refuge, its thick stone walls keeping it pleasantly cool. Sister Agatha decided to take action. After much prayer and thought, she wrote a letter to the bishop, detailing her observations of Father Malachi and Yesenia. She placed the envelope in her desk drawer, intending to mail it after evening mass. In the meantime, Brendan O'Reilly was conducting his own investigation. His private investigator had gathered information about Yesenia's past, including documents about her illegal border crossing. O'Reilly had prepared an anonymous letter to the immigration office, but was slow to send it. he still hoped to use the information as leverage against the church. Malachi and Yesenia now met at the city library, where she was studying for her exams. Their relationship had become more frank. They could no longer pretend that it was only friendship between them. Yesenia told him about her plans to get asylum, about her dream of becoming a nurse. Malachi felt alive for the first time in years. One evening, Sister Agatha stayed longer than usual at the church. She heard footsteps in the main aisle and quiet voices. Peeking out from behind a column, she saw Malachi and Yesenia. They stood close together, his hand resting on her shoulder. Sister Agatha could not make out the words, but the intimacy of the moment was obvious. The next morning, the envelope containing the letter disappeared from her desk. Long days of mutual suspicion and reticence began. Malachi noticed the wary glances of Sister Agatha. O'Reilly made more frequent appearances at the church, his presence felt as a silent threat. In mid-August, the church was planning a big celebration, St. Patrick's Day. A concert by the church choir and a charity dinner were being prepared. Yesenia actively participated in the preparations. Her organizational skills were highly valued by the parishioners. But tension hung in the air. On the day of the feast, the church was full of people. After the service, everyone gathered in the church garden. O'Reilly gave a speech on the importance of keeping traditions alive, casting meaningful glances at the group of Hispanic parishioners. Sister Agatha noticed how pale Yesenia turned. That same evening, a body was discovered at St. Patrick's Church. Detective Prudence Holloway, who arrived on the scene, immediately realized that this was not going to be an easy case. She methodically examined the crime scene, noting every detail: an overturned candlestick, signs of a struggle, blood spatters on the stone floor. Time of death is between 9 and 11 p.m., the medical examiner reported. Cause of death is obvious. Holloway nodded, making notes in her notebook. A detail caught her attention. There was a crumpled envelope with an unfinished address under the bench. She carefully packed it into an evidence bag. "Interview everyone who was at the church that evening," she ordered, "and check the security cameras in the neighborhood." By morning, news of the St. Patrick's Church murder had spread throughout Portland. Reporters were besieging the police station. Detective Holloway methodically interviewed witnesses, putting the pieces of the mosaic together into a coherent picture. She interviewed Father Malachi first. He looked shaken, but kept his composure. Sister Agatha was next. The elderly nun seemed strangely calm. Brendan O'Reilly arrived at the station accompanied by a lawyer, and Yesenia Rojas had disappeared. Her phone wasn't answering, and her rented apartment was empty. Holloway sensed that there was something more behind the obvious pattern of the crime. She began to dig deeper, examining the relationships between members of the church congregation. Bills, letters, surveillance footage, anything could be a clue. By the end of the first day of the investigation, she had her first leads, but she wasn't in a hurry to jump to conclusions. 20 years of police work had taught her patience. She knew that the truth often lurked in the details, in the unspoken, in the bits of information that people tried to hide even from themselves. Before going to bed, she looked at the crime scene photos again. Something was bothering her, some detail she couldn't quite grasp. The phone rang on the desk. Forensics had found something interesting on the surveillance footage. Detective Prudence Holloway had spent the entire night in the police archive. Surveillance footage showed that on the night of the murder, several cars drove up to the church. One belonged to O'Reilly, another to a local delivery service. A third could not be identified because of a dirty license plate. The morning began with a second interrogation of Father Malachi. This time, Holloway prepared more thoroughly by researching his background. Before coming to Portland, he had served a small parish in Vermont, from which he had suddenly transferred 12 years ago. "Father Donovan, tell us more about your transfer from Vermont." Holloway watched his reaction carefully. It was a routine assignment. The church needed a new priest. "And the fact that there was a fire in that church before you left was also routine?" Malachi turned pale. The fire story was a thing of the past. No one had been hurt, insurance had covered the damage, but it was after that incident that he'd been transferred to Portland. At the same time, other detectives were looking for Yesenia. Her neighbors said that on the night of the murder saw her leaving the apartment in a hurry with a small bag. A check with the migration service showed that her asylum case was pending. Sister Agatha proved to be an unexpectedly useful source of information. She knew all the secrets of the congregation from her years of working in the church. She spoke of O'Reilly's strange behavior in recent months, his threats to cut funding for church programs. "He changed after his wife left him for someone else," Sister Agatha shared. "Became obsessed with controlling everything that goes on in the church." Holloway sent out a request to review O'Reilly's financial transactions. The results were interesting. His business was in serious trouble, with several restaurants operating at a loss. Yet he continued to make large donations to the church. During the investigation, unexpected details from Yesenia's past came to light. In Guatemala, she actually studied at the medical faculty, but was forced to flee after her brother, a journalist, published an exposé about the local drug cartel. The brother was killed and she was added to the persecution lists. Maybe her past caught up with her here, Holloway pondered, looking at the evidence board in her office. Forensic experts had provided new data. They had found paint particles on the murder weapon that matched the paint that had recently been used to paint the church garden fence. There were signs of a struggle in the garden and a scrap of cloth caught in the rose bushes. O'Reilly held firm under repeated questioning, but his alibi for the evening of the murder was corroborated only by the words of his assistant. A check of the security footage showed that his car had left the church parking lot well after the reported time. Holloway methodically reconstructed the events of that evening. After the celebration, most of the congregation had dispersed by 8 o'clock. A few people remained in the church, including the victim. Between 9 and 11, the murder had occurred. Cameras recorded 3 cars leaving the area in that time frame. An important piece of evidence was a letter found under a church pew. Laboratory analysis showed that the paper matched that used in the church office. The handwriting belonged to Sister Agatha. "I had to inform the bishop," the nun admitted during another interrogation. "What was going on between Father Malachi and that girl? It's not right." Detectives checked all calls made from public payphones in the area of the church. One call caught their attention in particular, to the immigration office, made an hour before the murder. By the end of the week, Holloway had several leads, each with its own strengths and weaknesses. She laid out all the evidence in chronological order, trying to see the big picture. "Everyone is hiding something in this story," she told her partner. "The fire in Vermont, the dark past in Guatemala, O'Reilly's financial problems, Sister Agatha's unfinished letter. It's all connected. We just need to figure out how." The investigation continued, and each new day brought new questions. But Holloway felt she was getting closer to a clue. All that was left was to find the last piece of the puzzle, and everything would fall into place. Autumn rains covered Portland as Detective Holloway received the results of the latest forensic analysis. The analysis of the paint from the murder weapon had yielded an unexpected result. It revealed microscopic wood particles characteristic of old church pews. That morning, she called Sister Agatha in for questioning. The elderly nun looked haggard, but held herself with her former dignity. "Tell me about the fire in Vermont," Holloway began. "You served in the same church as Father Malachi, didn't you?" Sister Agatha's face trembled. She was silent for a long time, going over her rosary before she spoke. "There was a woman then, too, a young parishioner. I warned him, but he wouldn't listen. The fire, that was a warning. No one was to be hurt." Sister Agatha's confession was the final piece of the puzzle. Holloway remembered the unfinished letter found in the church. It was meant for the bishop and contained information about Malachi and Yesenia's relationship. That same day, the police arrested Sister Agatha. The interrogation lasted several hours. The story that was revealed to the investigators turned out to be a tragedy of jealousy, duty, and obsession. Sister Agatha had been following Malachi for 12 years. She considered herself his keeper, the protector of his sacred ministry. When Yesenia came along, history began to repeat itself. A letter to the bishop should have ended the relationship, but Yesenia found him and confronted her sister Agatha. She said she loved him, the nun confided, that they were planning to leave together when she got her papers. "I couldn't let that happen, not again." The murder weapon turned out to be an old candle stand. Sister Agatha was waiting for Yesenia at the church after the feast. A struggle ensued. One blow and it was over. O'Reilly had indeed blackmailed the church by threatening to report Yesenia's illegal status, but he had nothing to do with the murder. His financial problems and the call to the INS turned out to be a coincidence. Malachi learned the truth the day after Sister Agatha's arrest. He came to the station, aged and broken. "I should have realized," he told Holloway. "All these years she followed me, thinking she was protecting me, and I didn't." Yesenia was found in Boston, where she had been hiding out with friends. The news that her sister Agatha had been arrested caught her on a bus on her way to Canada. She returned to testify. Sister Agatha's trial was short. Her lawyer built a defense of insanity, but a psychiatric evaluation showed that she was fully aware of her actions. St. Patrick's Church got a new priest. Malachi left the ministry, and after much deliberation, decided to devote himself to working with troubled teens. Yesenia received political asylum and continued her nursing studies in another state. O'Reilly sold his restaurants and moved to Florida. His last act in Portland was to make a large donation to an immigrant relief fund. Detective Holloway remembered the case often. It taught her that the worst crimes are not committed out of hate, but out of a twisted love and a desire to protect what one believes is right. Sister Agatha died in a prison hospital 2 years later. Until her last day, she was sure she had done the right thing. Services are still held at St. Patrick's Church. A new priest is developing social programs helping immigrants, but old-timers say the church has changed. Something is gone irrevocably. Maybe the innocence, maybe the blind faith in absolute righteousness. And the roses planted by Yesenia still bloom in the church garden, a reminder of the thin line between love and obsession, between protection and destruction.